Your nervous system cannot tell the difference between being punched and being ignored by someone you love. The same neurons, the same region of the brain that registers physical pain, lights up when you are excluded by someone close to you. This was confirmed in a 2003 fMRI study at UCLA, and the overlap was precise enough that researchers proposed our social attachment system may have borrowed the pain circuitry to keep us bonded to the people we need most, which means the silent treatment was never minor. Take a slow breath. We have time. Every time they went cold on you, every unexplained withdrawal, every night of being looked through rather than looked at, your nervous system was registering something with the neural signature of a physical injury. And there is a finding I want to hold until the second half of this, about why those moments of warmth, when they came back, were so extraordinarily hard to let go of, and what the research actually says they were doing. Because the answer is not what most people expect, and it changes the meaning of everything. But to understand it, we have to go back to what the science thought it knew about this kind of person. And here is why you had no language for it. Because the psychology, for most of the 20th century, only recognized one version of this. The picture was familiar, loud, commanding. The person who walked into a room and immediately began reorganizing it around themselves. Their stories, their grievances, the warm light of other people's attention bending toward them. Certain of their own greatness, and not especially interested in hiding it. This picture had a formal name. Narcissistic personality disorder first appeared in the third edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders in 1980. The diagnostic criteria described a pattern most people would recognize on sight: a grandiose sense of self-importance, fantasies of unlimited success or power, a constant requirement for admiration, and beneath all of it, a striking and persistent absence of empathy for others. The person this described was visible. They announced themselves. In relationships, they controlled through force of personality, demanding, performing, punishing any withdrawal of attention with open anger. Clinicians and researchers understood, relatively early, that this presentation was probably not the only one. But for decades, it absorbed most of the attention, both in academic literature and in public understanding. The grandiose narcissist was the one in the cautionary stories, the one people warned you about at parties, the one whose behavior, eventually, drove everyone away. What nobody warned you about was the other one, the one who seemed to have had the harder life, the one who asked about you first, the one who noticed small things, and who needed, quietly and persistently, for you to be there. That version had a different name. And it took decades of careful, often contested, clinical work to understand what it actually was. The question that drove those decades of observation was deceptively simple. What happens when the person who slowly depletes you doesn't announce themselves? As early as the 1980s, psychiatrist Glenn Gabbard, working from careful observation of patients who didn't match the standard clinical picture, began describing a second presentation of narcissistic personality. These individuals arrived in therapy not with obvious grandiosity, but with its precise opposite: profound shame, a chronic sense of being wronged, a persecution that felt completely real from the inside. They were hypersensitive to criticism in ways that seemed almost involuntary. They withdrew from relationships rather than dominating them. And yet, Gabbard observed, the internal structure was recognizable. Beneath the apparent fragility was the same underlying core, a belief in their own specialness, a constant monitoring of how they were perceived, and a striking inability to genuinely register the emotional experience of the people around them. But there was something strange in the data, something that changed what researchers thought they were actually measuring. In 1991, psychologist Paul Wink formalized this distinction, identifying what he called the grandiosity exhibitionism and vulnerability sensitivity Dimensions of Narcissism. His analysis showed that these two presentations, however different on the surface, shared the same underlying architecture: entitlement, a fragile relationship with self-esteem, and a deep but differently expressed need for external validation. Then, in 1997, psychologists Jonathan Hendon and James Cheek developed the hypersensitive narcissism scale, a measurement instrument designed specifically for the covert presentation. It captured characteristics like quiet envy, chronic feelings of being unappreciated, withdrawal from situations where one might be compared unfavorably, and resentment that rarely expressed itself directly. This was a narcissism organized around shame rather than exhibition, around hiding rather than performing. The covert narcissist, called in various clinical texts the vulnerable narcissist, the closet narcissist, the shy narcissist, had at last a set of coordinates. They were not less narcissistic than their overt counterparts. They simply expressed it inward, and through mechanisms that were far harder to see. Here's where the story becomes important. Because this subtlety, this lack of visible warning signs, is precisely what makes the damage so difficult to name, and so difficult to defend against. The person who seems most in need of your gentleness may be the person from whom your recovery will take the longest. What does covert narcissism actually look like from inside a relationship with it? It rarely announces itself. The traits a researcher would identify on a clinical scale: hypersensitivity to criticism, hidden grandiosity, envy camouflaged as support, a chronic victim mentality, do not appear as a list. They appear as a texture, a way of being in shared space together. There is always something harder happening to them than to you. Not because their life is objectively worse, but because that framing is necessary. Because if your pain is acknowledged, it implicitly reduces theirs, and their emotional survival requires them to remain the most burdened person in the room. This is not usually a conscious strategy. It operates below deliberate thought, embedded in reflexes shaped long before you arrived. When you share something difficult about your own day, a frustration, a fear, a small grief, the conversation pivots, gently but reliably, back to them. The pivot is smooth enough that you often don't notice it happening until hours later, sitting alone, when you realize you never actually finished your sentence. That you started to say something about yourself, and by the time you were done, you were somehow taking care of them instead. Not malice, reflex. There is also the phenomenon researchers and clinicians have documented extensively under the term gaslighting, a word derived from a 1938 stage play in which a husband systematically convinces his wife that her perception of reality is faulty, that she is losing her mind, in order to conceal his own crimes. In the context of covert narcissistic relationships, gaslighting rarely involves elaborate schemes. It is quieter than that. It is, "I never said that." It is, "You're being too sensitive." It is a slight smile when you bring up something that hurt you, a smile that suggests your concern is, somehow, charmingly disproportionate. Over months and years, this quiet rewriting of shared reality accumulates into something clinical. You stop trusting your own account of events. You find yourself rehearsing what you'll say before you say it, editing out the "as," parts that might be turned against you. You become, as one researcher described it, your own jailer. And then there is the silence. Here is something worth pausing on. In 2003, neuroscientist Naomi Eisenberger at UCLA conducted an fMRI study in which participants were placed in a brain scanner and made to feel socially excluded. Left out of a simple computer ball-tossing game they believed involved real people. What the imaging revealed was striking. The anterior cingulate cortex, the same region of the brain that registers the distress component of physical pain, showed heightened activity during exclusion. The overlap was precise enough that Eisenberger and colleagues proposed the social attachment system may have borrowed from the physical pain system across mammalian evolution, because being cut off from your group was, for millions of years, as dangerous to survival as a wound. Subsequent researchers have debated the precise interpretation of this overlap, whether it reflects pain specifically or a broader alarm response. But the evidence for shared neural circuitry between social and physical harm remains substantial across the literature. The silent treatment, which covert narcissists deploy with notable consistency, withdrawing entirely from emotional contact as punishment and control, is not merely uncomfortable. According to this body of neuroscience, it registers in your nervous system in ways that parallel physical harm. Your body does not easily distinguish between the two. The distress is real. The wound is real. It simply leaves no mark that anyone outside the relationship can see. There is a sequence that clinicians working with survivors describe with striking consistency. It begins with what feels like extraordinary attunement. In the early stages, you're with someone who seems to be the most perceptive person you have ever met. They notice things. They remember things. They ask about the small anxiety you mentioned in passing 6 weeks ago. They seem to understand, without being told, exactly what kind of care you most needed and never quite got. The thing most human beings want most deeply, to be genuinely seen. You suddenly have it, completely. It is intoxicating. Not because you are naive, but because it is, in those early months, real. They are paying close attention to you. The attention is genuine. What is not yet visible is the purpose it serves. And here's the finding that most people get exactly backwards. Based on what clinicians consistently observe, covert narcissists tend to make warmer initial impressions than their overt counterparts, reading as sensitive, thoughtful, even self-deprecating on first meeting. The person most obviously performing their own importance is rarely the one who does the lasting damage. The one who does is the one who noticed your particular loneliness and made you feel, briefly and completely, as though you had been found. This phase, often called love bombing in the clinical literature, is not necessarily deliberate in the covert presentation. The grandiose narcissist sometimes deploys it strategically. The covert narcissist often does it instinctively, because this is how they have always moved through the world, mirroring, attuning, becoming whatever the other person needs, because being needed is the closest thing to safety they know. Then something shifts. It is rarely dramatic. There is no clear before and after. It is more like a slow change in the climate, almost undetectable day by day, unmistakable in retrospect. The attentiveness becomes intermittent. Conversations become more reliably about their feelings, their struggles, their grievances with a world that persistently fails to recognize them. When you raise a concern about how things feel between you, your concern becomes evidence of your own inadequacy. You are too demanding, too needy. You don't understand what they're carrying. You should know better. And yet, there are still, intermittently, the moments that recall the beginning. A gesture, a few days of the person you fell for. And you hold those moments very carefully because they feel like evidence that the person you loved is still there. That if you could just find the right version of yourself, everything could return to what it was. This is a profoundly important mechanism, and there is a finding about it, about why those moments held such extraordinary power, why you couldn't leave, why even now you might not be able to fully put it down. That goes deeper than anything that can be explained by ordinary love. Let me take you to it. In the early 1980s, psychologists Donald Dutton and Susan Painter developed what they called a theory of traumatic bonding. Through careful clinical study of abusive relationships, they identified two features that, working together, reliably produced an intense and lasting emotional attachment in the person being harmed. a significant power differential, and intermittent, unpredictable cycles of warmth and withdrawal. In 1993, Dutton and Painter published a study of 75 women who had recently left abusive relationships. They measured emotional states immediately after leaving, and again after 6 months. What they found shifted how researchers understood these attachments. Relationship dynamic variables, specifically the intermittency of mistreatment and the shifts in power, accounted for 55% of the variance in how strongly attached the women remained to their former partners 6 months after separation. Not the severity of what had happened, the unpredictability. Let that sit for a moment. Your brain, faced with an inconsistent schedule of reward and withdrawal, does not disengage. It intensifies. It becomes more preoccupied, more vigilant, more committed to resolving the pattern. Because from an evolutionary standpoint, unpredictable reinforcement has always been more motivating than consistent reinforcement. This is the same mechanism that makes gambling more difficult to stop than a guaranteed payout would be. It is B.F. Skinner's intermittent reinforcement schedule, first documented in animal behavior research in the 1950s, and present with a kind of terrible fidelity in every relationship where warmth and coldness arrive without a pattern you can learn. Research by anthropologist Helen Fisher on the neuroscience of romantic attachment suggests that love activates the same neural pathways associated with reward and craving. When the source of that activation is also the source of unpredictable withdrawal, the dopamine system does not quiet. It escalates, orienting entirely around the question of when warmth will return, what might bring it back, what you might have done to make it leave, which means this: the warmth was not a reprieve from the control. The warmth was the control. Take a breath. That is the whole of it, in 2 sentences. It may take a long time to stop feeling like something that needs arguing with. Everything you held on to, every moment you said, "But they can be this person." That was not weakness or delusion. It was your nervous system responding precisely as it had been conditioned to respond, to a set of conditions calibrated, however unconsciously, to produce exactly that response. You were not confused because you were foolish. You were confused because that is what the dynamic creates. You may have spent years trying to decide whether what you experienced was serious enough to explain how you feel. You compare yourself to people who survived more visible harm and find yourself uncertain. There were no bruises, no public scenes. Nobody else saw anything. Often, everybody else saw the opposite: a partner who seemed sensitive, thoughtful, and deeply caring. Someone who spoke about the relationship with warmth to anyone outside of it. Someone who, if asked, would express genuine concern for the very person they were, in private, slowly unraveling. One of the more disorienting aspects of this, and it is worth naming directly, is that the very absence of visible evidence is frequently used to dismiss it. Visible harm has witnesses. Invisible harm asks you to be your own witness, within a psychology that only recently developed its language for this kind of damage, and within a culture that has not always been especially willing to believe it. If you are the person this is for, and you will know if you are, this is the part that matters most. Clinicians working with survivors of covert narcissistic abuse have documented consistently a symptom profile that mirrors complex post-traumatic stress disorder, a clinical designation for trauma resulting not from a single event, but from prolonged, inescapable exposure to a controlling or unpredictable environment. The symptoms include hypervigilance, a constant scanning of the emotional atmosphere of any room you enter, a body that does not know how to stop bracing for the next shift in temperature. They include perceptual confusion, the lingering uncertainty about whether your account of events is accurate, whether you were the problem after all. They include what trauma therapist Pete Walker has described as emotional flashbacks, moments when something small in the present triggers a wave of shame or formless dread that seems disproportionate to what just happened, but is, In fact, the residue of hundreds of earlier moments your nervous system stored and never fully processed. None of this requires physical violence. None of it requires a single moment dramatic enough to point to. Not a metaphor, a measurement. The harm is real, even if no one else saw it. Even if you are not entirely sure you believe that yet. Your body keeps the account even when your mind has been persuaded to dismiss it. To understand the origins of covert narcissism is not to excuse it, but it may explain something specific, that particular quality of these relationships where you felt repeatedly as though you were hurting them simply by having needs of your own. Psychoanalyst Heinz Kohut, developing what became known as self-psychology across his clinical writing in the 1970s and 1980s, proposed that healthy, stable self-esteem, the kind that does not require constant external maintenance, develops through a specific quality of parental attunement in childhood. He called the essential parental function mirroring, the consistent, genuine reflection of a child's emotional experience back to them, in a way that says without words, you are real, what you feel matters, you are valid. When this mirroring is absent, when the parent is emotionally unavailable, unpredictably warm and cold, or when the child's inner life is chronically dismissed or co-opted for the parent's own needs, the child does not develop a stable internal source of self-worth. What develops instead is a self that must be maintained from the outside, a self exquisitely sensitive to perception, because perception has been, for as long as they can remember, the only stable indicator of whether they are safe. Otto Kernberg, working from a related psychoanalytic tradition, observed that a cold or chronically critical early environment can lead a child to construct an inflated internal self-image as a defense against shame, a way of maintaining psychological coherence when the external world consistently fails to provide it. The grandiosity in both Kohut's and Kernberg's frameworks is not the origin of the trouble. It is the response to something much older and much more frightening. And here is what that particular origin story produces in the relationship you are actually in. Because this is where the theory stops being abstract. A self built entirely on external validation cannot tolerate a partner who also has needs. Your needs were not too large. They were simply in competition with a survival system that had been running, uninterrupted, since childhood. One that had no space for the possibility that someone else's pain might matter as much as its own. And here is something the research found that most people never hear. In 2023, a study by Boraz Leon and colleagues published in Frontiers in Psychology measured cortisol reactivity, the body's stress hormone response, in grandiose and vulnerable narcissists exposed to identical psychosocial stressors. Vulnerable narcissists showed significantly higher cortisol reactivity than their grandiose counterparts. Their internal physiological distress was measurably greater. The person who was the most difficult to recover from may have been the one suffering the most. That is not a reason to minimize what happened. It is simply what the data shows, and it changes the picture of what you were actually living inside. Clinicians, including those writing in peer-reviewed psychiatric literature, have noted that covert narcissists tend to have experienced more early developmental trauma than their overt counterparts. In many documented presentations, they arrive in therapy as genuinely suffering people. People who have been in pain for a very long time, who have developed across decades a set of relational strategies that temporarily alleviate that pain by drawing validation from others, while simultaneously preventing anything like real intimacy from forming. In many clinical accounts, the covert narcissist genuinely believes they are the wronged party. They are not performing victimhood. They experience it. They live inside a narrative of being perpetually misunderstood, perpetually overlooked, perpetually failed by everyone who promised to be different. And when you eventually reached your limit, when you finally said, "This is not okay," that arrived for them as yet more evidence that the world, as it always had had turned against them. This does not change what happened, but it may explain why it felt so impossible to confront and why the confusion was so total. You were not imagining that dynamic. It was real. It simply had very little to do with you. And here is what that means for you. If you have spent months or years wondering whether the problem was your capacity to love, recovery from this kind of harm begins almost always with a name. Not because a label explains everything, but because naming interrupts the specific psychological isolation that covert narcissistic abuse creates. One of the central features of this dynamic, rarely conscious, rarely deliberate, but persistent, is the progressive dismantling of your ability to trust your own account of events. You spend months or years in a sustained state of uncertainty about whether your perceptions are accurate, your reactions proportionate, your needs reasonable. When that uncertainty is at its height, you are most effectively controlled by it, because a person who doubts their own mind will not confidently leave, or set a boundary, or ask for help. A name interrupts that. It says, "This is a documented pattern. Other people have been here. There is language for what happened. There is a specific task at the center of this recovery." And it is not what most people expect. It is not learning to trust other people. It comes before that. Therapists working with recovery from this kind of relational harm draw on a range of approaches. Among them, cognitive behavioral therapy for restructuring the distorted self-perceptions that accumulate from years of being told your reactions are disproportionate. EMDR for processing the residue of repeated, smaller violations that your nervous system never finished integrating. And here is what that means specifically. If you have spent months thinking that the way you responded to this relationship was evidence of something broken in you, it wasn't a flaw in your wiring. It was your nervous system doing exactly what a nervous system does when it has been chronically harmed and never given the space to finish processing it. Schema therapy addresses the deeper early life patterns that shaped vulnerability to this dynamic in the first place. The research on what helps is still developing, and no single approach has been identified as definitive. What the clinical literature does consistently report is that recovery is built around one central task: the restoration of trust in your own perception, not certainty about every detail of what happened. Trust, the basic sense that when something felt wrong, something was wrong. That the confusion itself was information, evidence of a particular relational pattern, not evidence of a broken capacity to love. From there, the work tends to move toward what clinicians describe as the recovery of self. Over time, these relationships often organize your life around the other person's emotional world, their moods, their crises, their need for reassurance, the particular performance of the relationship for people outside it. You gradually lose contact with your own preferences, reactions, and rhythms. You become, as one therapist described it, an extension of someone else's interior life, with very little interior life remaining that is clearly your own. Coming back to yourself after that is slow. It is not dramatic. It involves small things. Noticing what you actually like, catching the moment when you automatically minimize a need, and choosing just once to stay with it a little longer. It involves learning, in the body, what a stable relationship actually feels like, which for many survivors is genuinely unfamiliar. The regulated calm of being with someone whose warmth does not arrive on a schedule designed to prevent you from leaving. That can feel, at first, almost strange. The absence of vigilance takes some getting used to. The research on post-traumatic growth, foundational work developed by psychologists Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun in the mid-1990s, documents that many people who have moved through prolonged relational trauma emerge with a quality of perception and empathy that is, in some genuinely measurable way, unusual. Not because suffering is valuable in itself, but because the specific work of learning to trust your own inner life again tends to produce a person with uncommon clarity about what is real, an uncommon tenderness toward others who are still trying to find their way back to themselves. The loss is real. The years inside it are real. But you are not diminished by what you survived. You see more clearly now. You know what to trust. You are not in that first moment anymore. You are not the person sitting across from a therapist, searching for how to explain something that left no visible mark. Reaching for nothing actually happened as the closest approximation of the truth. The words that therapists kept turned away, covert narcissism, were not a diagnosis of you. They were a description of what was done. There is a difference, and it matters. One places the problem inside you. The other places it where it belongs. You were not broken. You were living inside a dynamic that required you to feel that way in order to keep functioning. What the research says, underneath all its careful language and measured findings, is something simpler than any of it. The confusion was real. The exhaustion was real. The harm was real, even without bruises, even without a single moment dramatic enough to point to, even without anyone else in the room who could see it. And you were not making it up. If this reached you tonight, and something in it felt like finally having a word for a feeling you've been carrying, the like and subscribe buttons are there whenever you're ready. It helps more people find their way to this particular kind of quiet. For now, let your shoulders soften. The window is there. The room is still. Let yourself rest.